Good morning and welcome you all to this Food Innovation Talk in Danish Food Cluster. We have been looking very much forward to this fourth episode of the Food Innovation Talk. And my name is Thomas Jacobsen and I'll be your host for today's episode. If you have any questions during this episode, please send them to us directly. You can fill in the form right next to the video. Today we will be talking about food fraud. In our last episode, we talked with IBM, who introduced the blockchain about food as a tool that might prevent food fraud in the future. But what is food fraud really about, and how can the companies deal with it? For today, we are visiting Eurofins Stein's laboratory in Vejen in Denmark to get some professional insights and some examples on how food companies can deal with food fraud. And I'm very happy to introduce both of you, Henriette Schönwand and Rikke Callesen-Dahl, food consultants at Eurofins Stein. And to begin with, Rikke, why are we talking about food fraud? Is it a new phenomenon?
No, it is definitely not a new phenomenon. If we look back to 1516, in Germany they got the Reinheitsgebot, which is a law stating the allowed ingredients for brewing beer. And in 1820, a guy named Frederick Accum wrote a book named There's Death in the Pot, which was mostly, meant for the housewife, and is about how to, with simple measurements, detect fraud with ingredients at home. Then in 1906, we started determining the freezing point of milk, because it was found that some of the milk was diluted with water, and that is actually how the Stein's laboratory in Denmark was started back in 1906. In 1981, the Eurofins company was founded based on the addition of sugar to wine and checking whether the origin of the label on the wines was correct. And they used the sniff NMR method, and if you see Eurofins, the name Eurofins is actually named after the sniff, because if you take it backwards, you get the fins, and Euro is because it was wine in Europe. Some of the newer cases is the melamine scandal in 2008, both in pet food in the US and baby food infant formula in China. And it was basically only detected because these babies started dying from it. And I think we all know the horse meat scandal from 2013. Yes. In this book from Frederick Accum, he also listed some of the top ingredients, products that are at risk of being adulterated. And if you compare this list from 1820 with the list from EU in 2013, you see that it is actually quite the same ingredients products that are being adulterated today as it was back in the time. So it is not a new phenomenon and quite relevant.
Yeah. And to go further into this topic, what do we need to know about the definitions regarding food fraud?
Well, we have from the EU regulation, it states that the food law shall aim to prevent the fraudulent or deceptive practices and the adulteration of food. Apart from this regulation, we mostly see it from the BRC and the IFS standards, where they have started making demands on a systematic approach to preventing food fraud. Because we don't have in EU a harmonized definition for food fraud, and this lack, you could say, might be a hindrance with regards to trying to stop the proliferation of food fraud. But so far we're using a kind of a broadly accepted definition that says that it's committed intentionally and to pursue economic or financial gain and through consumer deception. So that's the definition that we have to work with right now. If we take a look at this slide here, we get a little bit of a more information about whether or not we're talking about unintentional or intentional adulteration. We can see the food quality issues and the food safety issues might be relating to adulteration, but it's mostly unintentional. When we're talking about intentional adulteration, we can have the food's defense systems that are mitigating harm. And then we're talking about food fraud, where the motivation is gain. Of course, you can see the overlap of these different types. But what we're discussing today is the food fraud. Within the food fraud area, we also have different terminology that we can use to look at what different types of risks are there. Just to look at a few of them, we can see substitution might be one of them, where we might substitute a higher quality ingredient for a lower quality ingredient. Concealment, we have mislabeling. We had a recent issue here in Denmark with regards to the shelf life of ingredients for pizza. We have the grey market production, where we divert, for instance, products that should have gone through the correct lines that go outside of these lines. Unimproved enhancement, like Rikke talked about, the melamine addition to the baby food to add to heighten the protein content. Counterfeiting, copies of popular foods. We'll discuss a little bit about that later, what you can do to mitigate one of these issues. Dilution, as Rikke said, just the water in milk. So these are the different kinds of fraud that you can see within this area. Now that we're talking about whether or not this is for financial gain, you can see here this is kind of like what we're saying an iceberg looks like. If we look at the top of the iceberg, that would be where we see the detected fraud. If you're a really good fraudster, actually, you would say that this is not the place to be. This is the place to be, because this is smart, so that authorities, other companies might not detect what this is. This could be, for instance, leaves in spices. The detected fraud is a case of that might be the melamine in the baby food, because when babies start dying, then you don't earn enough money. So if you want to earn money during this food fraud, then you should stay in this area where we have the smart fraud. Once you start being really wanting to make money for instance, when you add too much melamine, or if you synthesize melamine so that it actually causes babies to die, then it's detectable. And for us as consumers, we would of course hope that the area up here would be the larger ones, but I still think that a lot of it is below the surface.
Yeah, and you already started a bit about it, but can you elaborate a bit about some examples, some findings?
Well, we're actually going into that a little bit later. So I think we'll save that for later when we go into some of the examples, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
So how can food companies secure their business for food fraud?
Well, we have... I'm sorry?
The examples.
Yeah. We have Europol and Interpol have actually done several large operations together. The most recent one is Opson 7. And during this campaign, more than 3,000 tons and almost 10 million liters of counterfeit food and beverages were found. And the value of these were 55 million euros. If we look at the Opson 6 campaign, they actually found more than 230 million euros worth. So it's a large-scale operation with these food frauds. What they found in the Upson 7 were chemically colored tuna. They found, again, fake baby milk powder. This wasn't with the addition of melamine. It was more a question of not containing the substituents necessary for actually making sure that the babies get all that they need. They also found methanol added to alcoholic beverages. So we have authorities working together to find out specifically if you have bilateral multinational companies working together within the food fraud industry. With regards of the illegal treatment or handling of tuna, apart from the coloration, we also saw that tuna sold as fresh tuna should have been termed canned. The definition between fresh and canned is a question of whether or not it is stored at -18 degrees or -9 degrees Celsius once they're caught. And the difference, as you can see here on the below here, is that fresh tuna is sold at 12 to 15 euros per kilos, whereas canned is sold at only 4 to 6 euros per kilo. So of course, if I want to sell it, I want to sell it as fresh tuna, if I'm a fraudster, that is. So this was one of the examples from the Upson campaign that we saw.
Another good example is also a honey. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it is one of the top 10 products also on Europe's lists. And one of the reasons that it is also a good example is that you see less and less surviving bees, and thus having a lower yield of production in generally. But we see an increase in the market on honey. So these things don't fit together. And then we also see there are large differences in the pricing on the honey on the market. Actually, then the Manuka Honey Association have made some analysis of their honey, and 56 of these samples analyzed showed that there was adulteration by addition of other sugars. And the main issues with food fraud in honey is exactly addition of sugar, cheaper sugars. Also, some of the bee farmers feed their bees with sugar instead of the botanical, flowers, rapeseed, whatever. So that might also be an issue.
Yeah. And following these examples for both of you, what can the companies do to secure themselves?
Yeah, well, as Henriette mentioned earlier, we have the BRC and the IFS standards, which are now demanding the companies to think about food fraud in their companies too. So what these standards says is that you must have a documented procedure for vulnerability assessment with respect to food fraud, as well as a documented plan describing the preventive measures for identified risks. And last but not least, the plan should support the management system for food safety. So you must incorporate a food fraud plan in your food safety system. Most of the systems, when you go to the vulnerability assessment, contains a pre-screening process. So you take all your ingredients, all your suppliers, put into this pre-screening program process, and end up with the ingredients and the suppliers at most risk, which you must take a further step.
Yeah. So this is actually shows very well that sometimes if you have a lot of ingredients or a lot of suppliers, getting to know all about them with regards to food fraud might be a little bit daunting. But once you do the pre-screening process, then you end out with hopefully a smaller amount of ingredients or suppliers that you need to really look into. If we look further into what the vulnerability assessment should include, we've been looking at different systems all through the what's available on the internet as well. And what we can see is if you know something generally about your business, you can see the level of corruption, both in with respect to the business area or the suppliers. The competition, if competition is high, then it might be an incitement to do more food fraud. If you already have internal controls of mass balance or traceability, then you're a long way. Because if you have a mass balance and you say that you have a mass balance of plus minus, for instance, 1%, something like that, then you might not be as susceptible to food fraud as if the mass balance shows plus minus 10%. And if you have full traceability, like you talked about, Thomas, the blockchain with IBM, then that could also be a preventative measure. Screening of integrity is a little bit of a new issue for us here in Denmark. If you have ethical guidelines for your employees or a whistleblowing system, it's not that common here in Denmark to have screening of integrity of your employees. But some of the BRC and IFS standards actually not demand that you have it, but ask you to, if you don't have it, then put something else in place. Industry codes might also be something that can help you with regards to preventing food fraud. And if you already have an effective enforcement of legislation, here in Denmark we have what we call rejseholdet, and they actually actively look for food fraud. They've mainly been concentrating their efforts towards candy, old candy, slaughtering of animals at home instead of at factories, some of these things. But if you have an effective enforcement of legislation, that also works as a safeguard against fraudsters. That was the general information that you kind of need to look into. If we look at raw materials, finished products, if you take a look at raw materials, the availability of knowledge and technology, you need to know something about whether it's easy to get a hold of these raw materials or the additions or substitutions that you want to put into them. If it's easy technologically to change something, then that's something you need to look into as well. Methods of analysis. Is it even possible to do analysis to see if you can prevent food fraud? The availability and also the cost. Something that you really need to look into is the supply chain complexity, because the more you know about your supply chain, the better you're equipped to see if this might actually be a risk or not. You can have an example here of a complex supply chain where you have many primary suppliers, you have a processing company, and then if you're the second processing company already there, you have a lot of places in your supply chain that something could go wrong before it ends up at the customer. Whereas if you have a simple supply chain where you have one primary supplier that you may have known for 25 years, you're then the processing company, and then it goes directly to a customer. Then it's much simpler to control this supply chain as to the more complex supply chain. You could also look at the history of fraud, and you can look at the availability and pricing of raw materials. Usually, for instance, if you make the food safety system, then it's usually the quality manager who looks at a lot of these things. Here it's quite important actually to look at some of the purchasing department, their expertise, to gain that to your assessment. because they know something a little bit more about if something, if the pricing on a product suddenly goes up. For instance, we saw vanilla pots this Christmas here in Denmark. The pricing went through the roof. That might be an incitement for a fraudster to actually look at, well, this is a product that I could earn a lot of money on. Maybe I should try and look at that. I think a lot of the systems out there look very much towards the assessment of the raw materials, whereas I think you also need to look at your finished products. You need to look at what goes on between you as the processing company and then the customer. That is where you can, for instance, see examples of counterfeiting of your products and tampering with your products as well. And we'll go into some of these examples a little bit later. Just to kind of like sum up on these vulnerability assessments and the screening process. If you look at some of the following parameters, you're a very large step of the way with regards to controlling the risk of food fraud. If you look at your supply chain, again, the complexity, the geopolitical and the financial considerations. One thing that you might need to look into also with regards to your supply chain is the age of product. If you have a wine that's maturing for 15 years or something like that, then it might be that you need to look back into history for quite some years to find out whether this has actually been at risk of fraudulent activity. The knowledge of your supplier. I know that a lot of companies now say, well, we just don't want to purchase from suppliers unless they have a BRC or a IFS certificate. That might be one part of doing that. But if you have a very good history with this supplier, that might also be something that you can use. And this history could include both food safety, legislative issues, quality, fraud. You need to look at the whole history that you have with this supplier. And also, if you do yourselves audits of these suppliers, the results of those, it's usually very easy to see if you've been at an audit and then find out if they are very compliant or if they issue information to you right away. Then they probably won't be the ones that are doing any fraudulent activity. If they are very good at answering to complaints, something like that, then they probably won't try to cheat you. And then the vulnerability with regards to food fraud, the availability of the raw materials, the possibility, the frequency that you need to perhaps do some analyzing for with regards to being able to detect it. And then the potential impact, because there are some products that you maybe only eat when in season. For instance, marzipan here in Denmark, we eat a lot of that during Christmas season. So if you want to do any frauds with regards to marzipan, then the Christmas season might be the season to do it. When you harvest apples, for instance, that might be the time of the year that you need to look into this is when they harvest these apples. If you have any specifically susceptible population groups, as you saw with the melamine within the baby food scandal. So if you look at the picture, the whole picture in with regards to this, and you try to do a systematic approach towards this vulnerability assessment, then I think you're far along in the process of trying to control the issues with regards to food fraud in your company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And now looking at the pre-screening process, but what can companies do after this pre-screening?
Yeah.
What is the next step?
Well, subsequent to this screening, you might actually find out that you don't know enough about this. So you can actually try to obtain additional knowledge. If, for instance, like I said, the knowledge of your supply chain is going to be very important. So if you need to know more about how they produce spices in Malaysia, then that's what you need to look into. If you need to know more about how they rice-producing countries have legislative enforcement, then that's what you need to look into. So you need to make sure that what you know is actually something you know and not something that you think. So I would start with that one, and then you could go on to introduce additional controls. And I'm not only, I know we come from an analyzing company, but I think you can do a lot of other things as well. If you look at mass balance, for instance, set up an acceptable limit of percentage that you're allowed to. You can look at supplier evaluations, something like that. And then I think you're well on the way with regards to reducing the risk of food fraud. If we look at other possible methods, a simple one is actually verification of labeling. If, for instance, on a wine, if you have a different post number as the city, then of course there's a discrepancy. And if you have packaging, destroy the leftover packaging. That's a simple thing to do to make sure that that your product cannot be copied into real packaging. Tampering, unbroken seals, for instance. Also, verifying analysis might be something that you need to do both on your raw material and your finished product. And then if you have any changes in your system, new suppliers, new raw materials, then updating the system is also very important, I think. Yeah.
And if you have to go further and you have to do these detections, you have to ask yourself, am I able to, at home, to see visually, and where do I have to verify by analysis? So if we take this example with the chili, and a well-known example is that you can add, for example, wheat, and use some of these illegal dyes to hide the addition of wheat. Then you see if you have the whole dried chili, you are able to see yourself that nothing have been done. If you have it more, not totally grounded, but in pieces, it's a bit harder to see if something have been added. But if you have this powder grounded totally, you might not be able to see it just looking at it visually if something have been done. So if we take another example with a fruit juice, you have now found out that you can't detect it only visually. You have to do some verifying analysis. There's a difference in how low and high the possibility of detection of food fraud is, depending on the amount of analysis you choose to do. I'm not saying that you have to do all of these. It also depends on the trust in the supplier. Is the ingredient at high risk of being adulterated? What did you get from your vulnerability assessment? But in general, the more analysis, the higher the possibility of detection of food fraud.
Yeah. And to all of us watching, the food companies, etc., where can we find additional information or additional help?
Well, there are different systems available, also as Henriette mentioned, on the internet. But we have here in Eurofins also made our own system, which we call the SAFE system, which stands for Screening and Vulnerability Evaluation Systems, which might also help with this
the process of
pre-screening. Pre-screening, yes. And if you want to know more about it, you're welcome to contact us. We are also holding courses throughout the years. So yes, we have also taken some examples which you might use later at home regarding financial trading, economic. There are some sites for the threats as well as for incidents. So all of these pages are examples that might help you at home with your assessment. Yeah. Here in Eurofins we also have what we call the Eurofins solutions, because we have started this networking group where we are meeting, I think up until now it's 2 times a year. For each meeting we have an overall subject, which will be the topic of the day, but also other topics will be mentioned, and there will be chance of exchange of experience with other companies in this networking group. And I can say that we are meeting, our next meeting is in November 20th, where the subject is Christmas. So we have wine, chocolate and marzipan. As well as the networking group, we also have these newsletters, which we will send approximately 10 newsletters a year. And this newsletter might also be a help to keep your vulnerability assessment up to date. So you don't have to check all these different sites at home, but you can get the newsletter and then we'll help you with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Time is running, and for all of you asking questions, we will answer your questions direct via email afterwards. So yeah, I would like to thank you both for your very inspiring presentations and the insights on this topic. And thank you all for watching. And if you still or afterwards come up with questions to Henriette or Rikke, you're welcome to send them to us and then we will connect you. If you want to stay updated on news from Danish Food Cluster, you're welcome to sign up for our newsletter. We hope to see you all next time at our Food Innovation Talk on October 30, where we'll be talking about 3D printed food. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this Food Innovation Talk by Danish Food Cluster. You can always visit our webpage for reviewing this Food Innovation Talk. Hope to see you soon and have a nice day.